Hilarious.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast. I am here with my usual fabulous best friend, co-creator, co-conspirator, and just all-around great guy. Hello, Barry. How are you? You love it. You
I
can't
think
live
you're
without
so.
my introductions.
Well, I know, but I think you're going to have to work on your introductions a little bit. I think I've been
You
the.
didn't like the all-around great guy?
Yeah.
You are an all-around great guy.
Yeah, I'm fabulous. I'm
It's too
great. How are you?
average. Too average to say. I'm very good because we have a really special guest on our podcast today.
Yes, I don't even know why I'm here because I have a feeling that this is going to be a conversation that I'm just going to try and.
Yeah, you may get edged out of this conversation, but I wanted you to be around for it because I just needed you to have the synergy with me and Kim, our guest, Kim Stewart. Hi, Kim. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great.
Kim,
Happy to be here with you both.
Thank
And
you.
I'm the only one not wearing makeup by Trinity in London.
True. We're willing to be sponsored by Trinity London.
We are definitely willing to be sponsored by Trinity
And
London.
it's not that I'm afraid of makeup. I just don't have any. Let's just put that on the table. It wouldn't be the first time I've worn mascara. Okay.
Noted.
Okay, when we spend some time together, every so often I'll go and spend a few days with Barry. I always am like, try this, put this on your face, put that on your face. And he loves it. He loves it. Gone are the days when Barry used to wear some black eyeliner, although I think those days need to be resurrected.
Yeah, well, like when I'm buried.
Well, we'll get it going one of these days. I'm sure it would be
I support it.
Quite a sight to see, yes. But anyway, I'm very excited to have you on our podcast, Kim, and this is so exciting. So to give everyone a little bit of a background, Kim is a great friend, a really good friend, and a very respected colleague. And we'll talk about her work in a minute. But Kim and I go way back, and we're going to talk a little bit about our story and kind of how we came to be conversation partners in this whole deconstruction situation, and a little bit about the work she does to contribute to this conversation at a psychological, psychotherapy, mental health level, because that is essentially what you do. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. Well, okay, Kim, before we jump back a little bit into our story and share a few little funny moments before we jump into some of the serious conversation, do you want to just say a little bit about who you are and what you do and the practice you have at the moment in Minneapolis? Do you want to say?
Sure. Yeah. So I let's see how to summarize that. So I like Maria said, I work in mental health, and so I have a master's degree in counseling and marriage and family therapy. I will work towards licensure in that. I'm also completing my PhD in psychology, and that's my path. So I will be a psychologist, a family psychologist, so a psychologist and a marriage and family therapist. I have lots of passions in that field, lots of interests. I really love working with family systems. I love working with couples, and some of the unique interests that I have within that are working with religious trauma, working with older adults, and working with relationship issues as well. So those are some of the avenues that I have traveled in my work. I'm still completing my training, so I'm not totally independent yet, and I'm still kind of seeking out ways that I can contribute, specifically with religious trauma. And so that's the conversation I'm here to have today. Yeah. And that's something that's really not well addressed in the field. It's not curriculum, and neither of my degrees in this field. It's not really addressed. It's not part of initial assessment of individuals when they seek mental health treatment. We're not asking questions related to, what is your spiritual history? What is your religious background? Is there any trauma associated with that? So I think still we're getting to a place of comfort with that conversation, and it's something I'm particularly passionate about. And I would say uniquely for me, that often the intersection of religious trauma and sexuality is something that I find myself doing a lot of work on.
Yeah. That's so good, because in the deconstruction conversation at the moment, there are a few things that are really centered in the middle of it. And one of those things is the traumatic effects of purity culture and purity cults, which is probably a better way of describing it. And so those intersections of religious trauma and sexuality, I mean, that's it right there. So many people have been damaged in terms of how they're meant to interpret their sexuality, their sexual needs, you know, how they should see themselves as human in the world, what's good about them, what's not good about them. And it's messed up a whole lot of people. And so purity culture is really at the center of a lot of these deconstruction conversations at the moment.
Absolutely.
And one thing that Barry and I have been talking about these last several weeks, as we've gone through our series, Talk Deconstruction, to me, is that there seems to be a couple things happening within the deconstruction conversation. One of those things is there's a lot of trauma that is being triggered and being brought up and being brought to the surface. And people are just letting it all hang out for the first time, maybe ever. Not that people haven't had important conversations around, you know, the traumatic experiences that, you know, religion, especially conservative and fundamentalist religion, can bring. But people are not kind of cowering in the dark about it anymore, because they're communities that are coming together to expose some of this stuff. But one of our things that we've kind of consistently said is, okay, like among this conversation, there does seem to be a lot of trauma, and the people who have experienced the trauma really need their mental health addressed. And that's not always happening. Not to say that the people who are leading these conversations, you know, you have just Instagram feeds going viral and TikToks and memes and all sorts of things that are poking fun at, you know, the way a lot of us conservative Christians grew up. And it's very kind of disarming, and it's good to laugh at it. But it's bringing up a lot of trauma for people, but they're staying in these conversations where the conversation partners aren't really equipped to address the trauma. Like even Barry and I, we're theologians, we're philosophers, we're innovators, we're a lot of things. We're not therapists, you know? So even as we're having these conversations, it's like people still need to go on further to get the proper mental health care they need, I think. Were you going to say something, Barry?
Oh, I was gonna sort of echo what you said, but also say that partly I think the challenge is quite often the conversation is on a kind of conceptual, theological level, you know, and sort of looking at the theological implications of, you know, belief and things like that. And I think and you know, you do hear a lot of, you know, the catchwords are, you know, trigger and trauma. I mean, and on one level, I think those words can be overused when there's not a kind of substantive understanding of what that actually means.
Agreed.
And how to sort of think about those things and what to address. But yeah, we've kind of been aware of, I mean, there are people that it's just evident that they need to talk through some stuff on an entirely different level. And, you know, that's a very personal thing, I think. And you know, not everybody's up for that even, but I do think it's an essential part of this. And how do you define religious trauma? Like, what's the scope of that in your mind?
That's an excellent question, because like I said, there's it's not something the field is rushing to define and to address in a really formal way. So for me, this feels a lot like I'm cultivating my own approach to it. I think there's capital T trauma and there's lowercase t trauma. So the capital T trauma is the combination of, you know, harmful religious practices and maybe personality or environmental factors that really combine to really do harm to a person. So to really immobilize them to make choices for themselves. I've seen people really just not really be able to engage in life because of so much fear and shame associated with decision making. So there's, you know, it's hard to define it because I think it is different for each person. You know, the same religious event could be kind of forgotten by someone, or it could be really gripping and really traumatic to someone else. So I don't have a great definition. I think there's kind of an ongoing assessment too What religious experiences have you had, and how has that affected you? And I think often the folks that I work with, I probably have that better defined for them than they do.
Sure.
I don't have people calling the clinics I work at and saying, do you have anyone that specializes in religious trauma? People are coming in, and there's a nuance to taking their history where I become aware of things, and that becomes a goal of treatment. But it's something that would be missed if not addressed by someone particularly interested and passionate about this work. Occasionally, I've had someone come to me and say, I have these really, really burning existential questions that I want to talk through in therapy. And sometimes it's religious in nature, but oftentimes it's, I want to choose my words carefully. The word sexual dysfunction is coming to mind, but dysfunction is often, pathologizing. So there's some concerns of a sexual nature in my relationship, in my marriage, or in my life. And it's a remnant of some period culture. So there are things that I can suss out a bit because of my own history, and really put together treatment goals that address those things. So I don't think that's a super clear answer to your question, but I think it's an important one. How is that defined? And in my work, it's important for that to be led by the patient and sort of co-defined with my help.
Yeah, actually, I actually think that was a great definition, because I think what you said is a really key thing, that a lot of it has to do with the particular effect that these things have on an individual, which is why it's such a complex. It's why the whole conversation, I think, is quite complicated, because there's so many layers, and as you said, some people just sort of bounce along and they sort of look back and they go, oh, that was crazy. But essentially their sense of themselves is they can function without, they can get over those things, whereas other people do seem kind of immobilized. And particularly, I mean, I taught at a theological school that actually had a school of psychology attached to it. A friend of mine who was in private practice down the street, their entire client base was sexually dysfunctional evangelical married couples who were messed up because of not only sort of purity culture things, but just the theological ideas beyond just abstaining from sex, but just even that sort of ridiculous idea that God's got the one perfect person for you. I mean, that can really mess somebody up when they think they found God's chosen person for them and they find out they've actually married an asshole.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, I dream to have a practice made up of that, because I'm so passionate about it and the work is so important. It's so necessary. And there are so few people equipped and also interested in doing that work. It's really important work.
Yeah, I feel like this is what's missing, a big piece of what's missing from the deconstruction conversation. I follow a lot of feeds. I'm actually a part of Facebook groups. I don't know how, I just get invited and I accept. I do almost nothing on Facebook, and I don't really engage too often as a follower with like all the big kind of deconstruction feeds and all that. I just kind of keep my finger on the pulse of it all. And I'm kind of watching and taking it in and seeing what people are saying, because they're just absolutely just viral and things are just kind of bubbling over all the time. But in a lot of these groups and the comments and all of that, people are so vulnerable and they're sharing so many stories, nightmarish stories, just horrible instances of being used and abused by pastors and church leaders and being told what they can and cannot do. And it's very destructive, and they get very raw and they get very real and they get very specific and very detailed. And they often don't know where to go with this stuff. It's this person just deserted me, or I was just told this, or I just lost this friend of mine, or, I've been a Christian for 40 years and now it's all falling apart and nobody's there for me. My identity is crumbling. And they're stating this stuff on social media platforms. So like the first part of me is like, I'm so happy they feel like they found a safe space. And then the next thought is, but it gets safer even than this with like someone like you, Kim, who can address these things and walk them through kind of the proper paradigms towards healing and understanding their brokenness and kind of building a life after it or on top of it or whatever. And I just feel like it's not talked about enough, or really hardly at all. And I'm not sure if it's because people who have these platforms are so popular, they want to sort of keep their popularity growing and not move their audience to like mental health professionals, or maybe we're just at the beginning of the conversation and we still have definitely a long way to go. And maybe, you know, the mental health thing will center soon. But yeah, I think that's a big concern of mine when I see these happening.
Well, I just don't think that part of the equation is, or I don't think that's in the general equation for a lot of people that come out of religion anyway. I think I've said this before, that one of the challenges for me is that people seem to think that religious conversations and religious issues happen in a vacuum, and that all you have to do is address the religious dynamic that's going on. And I just think that's fundamentally a flawed perspective, because you live out your religious life in the world and in your own sort of personhood and in your own community. And there are sort of reverberations on every level and aspect of what it means to be human. When it's not just I was messed up by some bad ideas,
right?
You know, so I get some better ideas, and I'll be. I mean, sure, we can. You know, you can always change ideas. We change ideas through life all the time. You know, but in the deconstruction conversation, I think there needs to be a bit more of a holistic perspective, that this is a whole person conversation about something that hasn't just impacted how you conceive or don't conceive of God anymore.
Absolutely. You know,
I don't know, I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a key way I define my work and my orientation to my work is that it's systemic in nature. That is a lot of the training that I have sought out, that, you know, these aspects of who we are not isolated. You know, we're not addressing our sexual nature over here, and our relationships and marriages over here, and our religious identity over here, and our relationship to the world and others over here. I mean, it's all connected, you know, it's all connected. And especially something as intimate as your religious experiences and your religious and spiritual identity. How can it not be impacted or be impacting everything else in your life? It really conceptualizes how you have engaged in the world, how you make sense of the world, how you make sense and meaning out of your relationships, and you know, events that are happening, and sickness and existential crises and all of these things. So it really is systemic, and it really does need to be treated more holistically than, well, let's just address this one piece and then everything else will be fine. It's just not true.
Yeah. So Kim, I don't know if you get asked about your own kind of, I'll just use the term for lack of a better one, your own deconstruction story, kind of going back to how we met and the context in which we found ourselves 20 years ago. So to date us, I'm 38. Are you also 38 at the moment? Are you still
37? 30? I will be 38 soon.
Okay. So the mid late 30s, I heard Deborah Messing's character Grace Adler on like the reboot of Will and Grace. She said late 30s. I loved it, so now I've adopted it. So we've known each other for 20 years, and we met at a conservative Bible college in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in fall of 2001. And we were practically on the same floor, really, just kind of down the hall. And the way I describe you when I talk about you to people is I think you were like one of my very first friends.
Yes.
And we were pretty close freshman year, kind of, I remember being very connected to you. I had other friends too, but we were like very close, and we just had a ball and just had so much fun. I remember we worked at the Gap together in downtown Minneapolis, and we thought we were so cool. We had like all these amazing at that time, 20 years ago, Gap was like
we really connected over fashion, or, you know, our sense of it at the time.
Yeah. And so we would have, you know, a day in the life of us back then would have been, you know, New Testament classes, Old Testament classes, classes on evangelism, all like for college.
Chapel every day. Right?
Yes. Chapel every day, worship,
praise nights,
gatherings.
Yes.
having to kind of sign into chapel because you only got so many skips, and having this intense pressure to go to a church every Sunday.
Lots of rules. We had a curfew, we're 18 living in Minneapolis, and we had a curfew. We had to, sign in, or it was, just really, like
we weren't allowed boys in our room. We weren't allowed
floors.
Again, no VCRs.
No VCRs.
Yeah.
No
That's
VCRs.
Insane. Isn't it insane to say it now?
It's insane. And it wasn't allowed specifically because the concern was the infiltration of, sexually graphic material. We weren't allowed to watch rated R movies, even on our own time off campus.
Certainly no drinking.
Yeah. We know VCR stands for vile, corruptive recording devices. But this is one of my embarrassing things that I hate to share, but I will because of the value of the journey. Is I remember being on the side of the fight against VCRs. I remember scheduling meetings with leaders of the denomination to fight to keep VCRs out, because I was so convinced that we needed to preserve the biblical holiness. Do you remember the holiness movement? The holiness of, and shouldn't we be fighting for holiness as opposed to fighting for, temptation? I remember standing up in meetings and having that argument. And I have chills even admitting that now. That's my vulnerability showing that that's how far I've come now. But look how successful you've been, because VCRs have gone away. So
they've gone away. I single-handedly.
Yeah, it's just you. It's you and your little crew of religious nut jobs.
VHS tape burnings, in the streets. And
exactly. Oh my God. If I had a dime for every time I stood up in a meeting in my life like that, just thought we were so righteous and so noble.
So righteous.
The good fight. And we've obviously moved on quite a bit in the last 20 years, and it's just been such an evolution, such a journey for both of us. And we find ourselves, at a very similar intersection at the moment, which is why we're still friends and we get along and talk often. But when we were, quote unquote, and people on the podcast can't see this, but I have air quotes right now, deconstructing, whenever it was, for me, it was probably more late 20s. So a good 10 or so years ago. We weren't calling it deconstruction then. No. This is like a fairly new thing. Yeah.
And no one that I work with, in the work that I do, no one has called it that. I think folks that are doing the work of deconstruction, it's in my personal experiences that it's been not part of this labeled movement that we see now in pop culture.
Yeah. So like when you were starting to dismantle some stuff, when you were starting to like poke at some of the, in my head, I see visuals. I see a house of cards. I see pulling back the curtain. I see all of these visuals that speak to me of my own process. But I never saw it as, I'm going to sort of dismantle all of this stuff and believe something new. It was more of like, something's changing in me. The things that I thought were true are becoming less true, and other things are becoming more true. And it just felt like this big roll down a hill. It wasn't like I was here and then I was transported here. It was just this kind of spiraling journey that just kept moving. Sometimes it stopped, sometimes it sped up, sometimes it, slowed down, sometimes it looked really, but I mean, for you, what was this process like for you?
Pretty different, actually. Mine was like a wrecking ball to the house of cards. So for me, it happened, pretty dramatically. So, well, yes and no. So this was my my final year at North Central, or you can edit out the name of that. We don't want to give them any press. My final year in college, I, as you mentioned earlier, I think that I'm a pastor's kid. My dad is an evangelical, pastor. And so for me,
did you grow up Assemblies, by the way?
What is that?
Did you grow up Assemblies of God? Did you grow up in Pentecostal?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So my dad was a Assemblies of God Pentecostal pastor my whole life, from birth on. So my identity was really connected to the performance of being a pastor's kid in a pretty small Midwestern town, and so I was good girl. I was pastor's kid. I was, on a pedestal that people created for me. And I was pleased to be there because I knew how to do that role. I could perform that role well. It was a good fit with my personality, but it's not the same for everyone. So there's all of these tropes about, the rebellious pastor's kids and falling off the map. And I relate so much to why that happens. It wasn't the same for me. But for me, when my deconstruction, quote unquote, happened, my final year of college, it was that my dad experienced what you and I have talked about a lot, which is the, kind of the famous, Pentecostal church split.
Yeah.
And so he was ousted from his church. And I mean, I have a lot of things to say about pastors, about evangelical leadership. I see a lot of a lack of integrity amongst those folks. And I think one thing that keeps me not bitter is that my dad is a man of integrity, and he always has been. And so to see this witch hunt that took place to sort of oust my dad, and then by extension my family from from our home, was really, really traumatic for me.
Yeah,
it really was. And so that was, for me, I remember getting the phone call, the phone call that it was happening, the phone call that there was, a vote, in that culture, you vote on your pastors. I remember as a child being paraded with my family on platforms in front of churches that would vote on whether or not we would move there. So to be voted out by an angry mob of people that are destroying your character was really traumatic for me. And it left me without a role. It was all of these people that I have spent my whole life proving myself to and being there for and creating my identity for. It was just gone. And so instantly I was sort of left feeling really raw and feeling like, well, I don't know who I am. I don't know who to be. But for me, I didn't do the go off the deep end. I think folks around me maybe thought that throughout my 20s. But for me, it was the house of cards was gone, and I need to figure out how to build that. And I remember having meetings with friends, meetings with professors, and saying, here I am, I'm 20 something years old. I've never said a swear word. I remember saying that, and it was true. I had never said a swear word, and I was 22 years old. I never had a sip of alcohol. I'd never, all these things. And it was why, and I didn't know the answer to the reason why. It was just, I don't know. And so I very systematically tested all of those things. I still remember my first drink of alcohol because I remember sitting at a TGI Fridays in Roseville, Minnesota, with a group of fellow students that were not deconstructing. And I remember, I was 22 years old, and I remember opening the menu, and it occurred to me for the first time when I saw the alcohol list that I was fucking allowed to order a cocktail. I remember that moment. I remember looking at it and thinking, I could just do this if I wanted to. It was wild to me. And I ordered one, and everyone freaked out. It was just like, what are you doing?
Were you still in school at the time?
I was still in school, because now I'm recalling that I dropped out. I dropped out of school my senior year because of what was happening in my family's life. I couldn't handle it. So I left, and then I came back. And so it was kind of a fifth year, but kind of a fourth year. And so I was a bit older at that point. And I was maybe 21 and a half, 22, but it was definitely past age 21. And I remember
it's not allowed to drink at this point.
You cannot drink. And, really the circles I ran with, nobody was doing that. I didn't have like some cool rebel friends who were like drinking on the side. Absolutely not. And so this was a kind of a shocking, I remember the table, and I remember ordering it and being kind of shocking. And I remember I ordered a Cosmopolitan, and I don't know why. It was because I just didn't know what anything was. And so I just said a thing that I saw, and I drank it, and I hated it. And then I just always drank after that. So for me, it was like dramatic and then not dramatic. I wasn't going to a party and doing 14 shots and ending up in the hospital. I just spent my 20s testing things that I didn't know anything about. And I think I really believed that lightning would strike. That's kind of what you were, and it sort of had the opposite of the intended effect. All of the sheltering that I experienced throughout my life. I was so sheltered. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything. And so I sort of realized, like, nothing is scary. and it's instead of being afraid of everything, then because I wasn't struck by lightning, I was afraid of nothing really.
Yeah.
And then I, proceeded throughout my 20s. I moved to California and I didn't ask anyone's permission, and I still remember those decisions being a big deal. Like I could just do this if I wanted to. And then I started a period where I remember thinking, oh my God, I can't do this thing because I could never tell my family. I could never tell my dad that I was going to have a male roommate. And so then my line of thinking was, well, then that's what I need to do, And so those are the decisions that I started making, because that was the only way I knew how to break out of the box that I was in. And it was I have chills now remembering how uncomfortable it was to call my dad and say, I'm moving to California. I found a roommate, his name is Adam, and I mean, these were like, I had 2 male roommates, the most benign dudes ever, but like from the world I came from, it's like, if you're in close quarters with a man, sex will happen, and 1, who the fuck cares? And 2, that's not even true, that's not even true. And so, and then I went from, working in hospitality and restaurants and managing, high-end fine dining steakhouses to managing VIP at a nightclub in California, in Santa Barbara. And I mean, for sure, my friends and family thought that I was off the deep end. And I had to have been like the most boring VIP host of a nightclub ever. I was just, I drank a lot, but I mean, I was still so like not into it,
Yeah.
I was still in control of my decisions,
Yeah, it's interesting how I think that sort of goes back to that whole thing of the wide spectrum of ways in which people experience the redefining of how they understand their whole life, and the ways in which different personalities manage those kind of decisions. And at the root of them, there's always initially that kind of insecurity, the what if, the ghost of religious past that haunts still. But I think what's interesting today is that most of that happens in a world where people are in constant contact with other people as well. And it's weirdly more isolated and not so isolated at the same time because of digitality. There's the opportunity to talk to all kinds of people. I mean, I think one of the reasons it's kind of so alive on the internet is because it's alive on the internet. So, there's a constant stream of people coming into the conversation. And not so long ago, those things had to be handled on a much more private and personal level, and usually without much support. Because most of the time you found yourself in a situation where everybody else was staying put. And then you were faced with the decision of what you do about that, which is also a big issue.
Yeah, especially when it's so tied to your communities, so for folks who are starting to question things, but all of their friends and all of their family are these evangelicals who are not questioning things, it's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. So I think one thing the online community can do is it offers permission to explore that. And Maria, like you said, there's a safe space, and then it's not complete.
Yeah.
Quite biblical though that your first roommate was Adam.
So true. That's why I chose him, actually.
Of course, I'm sure it is, Eve.
The dawn of a new man.
And like one thing I mean, there's no right or wrong way to have a journey. There's no right or wrong way to sort of go through this process. I've seen it enough to know that the knee-jerk reaction is to kind of spiral out of control a little bit with like newfound freedoms. Or even people who didn't mean to sort of transform or evolve out of one particular faith construct. But the moment I saw it a lot, it's funny, this just popped into my head. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but when we were all graduating from said Bible college, I remember the rules were so tight, they were so hard and fast. And people were getting kicked out for breaking these kinds of, people would get expelled for things like drinking or admitting to having premarital sex or, those kinds of things. It was just really, and at the time it was all like, ooh, but now it's like fucking sick. Like you sick people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I remember seeing a lot of people graduate and then all of a sudden be exposed to life without all of the rules and having no idea how to engage with normal parts of life. So there was this spinning out of control. There was the 14 shots and ending up in the hospital. There was this, you know, just, I'm going to sleep with as many people as I can. And not because I'm an empowered sexual being, but just because I don't know how to engage in any kind of
develop a sexual ethic. Absolutely.
You know, so that's like that's another dark side of all of this, you know, rule-based training and rule-based ethics, if, you know, you could even call it an ethic, is that people don't actually know how to engage their humanity well. And it's because people are taught this false binary of flesh equals carnality and spirit equals divine, and you need to go after the spirit and kind of kill your flesh. And so it makes sense. And then there's all of this talk about suffering and dying and, you know, sacrifice, and it's really painful, but you do it for God because there's this reward at the end. So as you're going through this really painful time of like, I'm going to shove down deep my sexual urges. I'm not going to engage these, you know, parts of me that, you know, or even feeling guilty for watching the movie that you can watch, but this rule says you're not supposed to, and then you feel like utter guilt. So if you abstain, you're in pain, but if you engage, you're also in pain, because then you feel the guilt and the shame of it, and it is just one big clusterfuck.
and that's you know, an intended byproduct of the religious system, you know, like that's what keeps people in place. And like you said a moment ago, you know, feeling so disconnected from your humanity, I think in the work that I do, reestablishing that connection, you know, call it a mind-body connection, call it what you want, but really finding your own voice, I guess, your own humanity, your own instincts for what is right and wrong, which again, we're really conditioned not to do. You know, it's, you know, anything that does not fit into whatever holiness sermon you're listening to, where certain passages of the Bible are being twisted and then being used to beat you over the head. Really, if we can untwist some of that and reconnect folks with their humanity and with their sense of, I'm a person with values, and even if those values are biblically based, you know, how do you reestablish a connection to yourself and that material that is secondary to outside voices who are influencing you or who have influenced you in really toxic ways for many years.
It's so hard. You have to learn to trust yourself.
Yes,
you have to learn to trust your intellect and your own sense of reason and your intuition. When we're taught for years that all of this stuff is really bad and not to be, and that is why people stay broken in these systems for so long, because they're taught, hey, if you feel doubt about any of this, if you're feeling in pain, if you're feeling uncomfortable, that is how your flesh should feel. Yes. It's not abnormal. That's how you should feel. You have to overcome that.
Yes.
And so,
so
people get feeling broken in really unhealthy situations because they're told to expect that, but they have to move past it.
And there you can see how easily that parallels to sexuality. And when you can't trust yourself to even engage with your own thoughts, how do you learn to trust yourself to engage with your own body? And the answer is you're not. You know, you're not taught that. And so the discomfort that people feel establishing a sexual relationship with another person when they're so disconnected from their own body, there's some dissociation that can happen. There's trauma, or there's just a lack of trusting yourself about what feels good, you know, what does consent mean? I mean, all those conversations that, you know, still are not happening in those really damaging evangelical circles. The idea of consent, you know, not just with sexual relationships, but what's that?
I said people are silencing the natural red flags that an individual would feel.
Yes, absolutely.
So then when those red flags go up in terms of like conversations and situations of consent, I shouldn't be feeling this way. This red flag actually isn't.
Yes. I must be wrong. I must be wrong. I must be wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big challenges is, and I actually don't think it's exclusive to evangelicalism. I just think evangelicalism has a more blunt way of doing things. But I think in general, modern Western Christianity likes to do people's thinking for them and hand them the kind of prepackaged stuff.
Yes.
And again, I think part of the challenge in this whole deconstruction conversation has to encompass both how you relate to ideas about authority, for instance, and how you learn to think for yourself and trust your own thinking when you've come from a world that essentially has told you that everything that you were thinking, because religion is, religion of conversion is predicated on the notion that your whole life was going in the wrong direction. Now it's going in the right direction, and here's all the things that you need to do in order to keep your life going in the right direction. And essentially you step into an ideological infrastructure, and at every point along the way you just add on. It's like add-ons, it's like you get a bit more and a bit more and a bit more, but it's all pre-digested, and it's all dressed up in dogma or doctrine or whatever it is. And I think when people are they reach a point where there's something that, whether it's your dad being kicked out of a church, that there's something, a crisis. There's a crisis within faith. I don't think it's a crisis of faith. I think it's a crisis within faith that suddenly the curtain is, you see the Wizard of Oz for what he really is,
Yes.
and but then the dilemma is, what do you do about that? And the issue, I think, is not to replace it with other stuff, but to work out what it really. So for me, I think the conversation has to go wider and on some level, arguably more peripheral, because you start to have to deal with things like the nature of how I understand belief, what I think about authority, what I understand about personal autonomy, and how that fits with any kind of religious belief, whether it's your religious past or your religious future, if there is one. You know what I mean? I think those are really challenging elements of. I think actually it's something that actually goes beyond just religion. I think that's what happens in education in the Western world as well. We're given prescriptive information that we're expected to digest and assume and take on board. It's like, I don't know. Anyway, blah, blah, blah.
No, that's an important transition in the conversation, because that's true. That's the idea that we have our thinking done for us. And like you said, not just in the church and not just in the evangelical church. A lot of my clients I've worked with on this come from Catholicism or other religious, I'm going to say, systems. But the idea that it is pre-digested, and it is, let me deliver you a pre-packaged method of thinking, and not even thinking. It's like, let's convince you that this is thinking, but we're actually going to replace the process of thinking with a set of ideas that we just want you to adopt. And it's really, I've found for myself, there is a lot of pushback, I'll say, to put it lightly, to show up as a thinker in those spaces that I used to call home, that I used to call community. And there is an othering of my experience as a thinker, and it is regarded as threatening, I would say, probably threatening is maybe the safest term. And so I had really damaging experiences as an insider, and then also as an outsider, which is a dynamic I think you spoke to, Maria. So how do you encourage thinking or inject thinking specifically into our Western ways? But how do you do that? I mean, that's something that I work to do in my work, but in the broader conversation, it's a real challenge that we have, specifically in this country, but in the Western world. How do you teach critical thinking when I think the machine is designed to do the opposite?
Yeah, that's so good. So to kind of bring our conversation to a little bit of a close, or to start to close it, I really kind of struggled whether or not I wanted to ask you this question. I'm not even sure it's really relevant to our conversation, so I'll let you kind of answer it or riff off of it anywhere you want. But what would you say about your faith engagement now? Given the fact that we've just talked about, so the last 20 years, a little bit how you grew up, your work, your thoughts, all of this, like, because I think people will want to know, okay, well, where did she land? Am I picking up between the lines that she's an atheist, or is she a closeted Christian? Has she kind of come all the way, like, do you want to talk a little bit more about where you find your being in terms of any kind of faith engagement that's left at all in your life?
I would love to. It will probably be infuriating for anyone listening in hopes that I will land on a organized answer. But I don't identify as atheist. Maybe theistic, maybe agnostic. You all have the language that I probably don't have to define, different constellations of religious identification. But I don't know. And I'm really comfortable, truly, I think probably for the first time in just very, very recent history, really comfortable with the not knowing, and really feeling like it's okay for me to identify as religious ? Spiritual ? Christian ? I don't know. There are bits that feel okay. And I think the bits that feel okay are still very primitive, the belief in something. Yes. The belief in, it's everything has an asterisk by it. I'm comfortable with belief and I'm not comfortable with belief. And so I think it's an ongoing journey for me. And I love that. So for me, how I identify is really comfortable with this journey to keep reading, to keep questioning, to keep dialoguing with others. And to me, that is the most authentic faith that I had never been able to have inside the context of church affiliation or religious affiliation. That to me, these conversations feel like faith, the sort of questioning toward, but without a direction in mind. Barry, you said, this faith of conversion says you're on the wrong path and now you're on the right path. And if you leave that path, you're on the wrong path again. And I feel like there's this meandering about me that is particularly infuriating to those who would like me to convert or reconvert or whatever you call it. But the meandering, I think, is my faith journey, and I'm really comfortable with that. In my travels and experiencing lots of different, temples and artifacts and things like that, I think maybe there's an element of universalism that, why the desire to convert into this, it's colonization, really, the idea of, white Christianity, I think. And really, are we all kind of doing the same thing in a different language? Are we all sort of worshiping a creator or a God or a set of gods that we just label differently? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one God, many gods. I don't know. I think there's a spiritual nature to humanity. And I think that is relatively universal. Even friends of mine who identify as atheists still really identify with meditative practices and yoga practices and things like that. So I think that is something that distinguishes us as human. And that is a journey that I'm happy to be on and happy to not define. I think the definition of it is what has felt so caging for me in my growing up years.
Yeah, it's interesting because people who kind of move on from the particular construct of Christianity that we've moved on from, either don't want anything to do with it, or maybe not don't want anything to do with it, but, like you don't really want to be confined to checking boxes, but just kind of want to leave it open and just kind of let their story continue to, be written. But then you have a lot of people who still want to make sense of a very deep narrative in a particular historical understanding of a religious system, AKA it's been Jesus my whole life. And so how do I continue to engage the Jesus story and the Christian narrative in ways that are really like helpful and constructive? And so, it's just really interesting because everybody sort of ends up in a different place. And I think, for us, we're not obviously not evangelists or proselytizers. We're not looking to sort of convert or like reconvert anybody. We're not even saying, hey, like be Christian how we're Christian. And I don't know that we go around saying we're Christian so much, but when people ask and kind of really pin us down, we have ways of talking about that stuff that is true to us. But really it's about helping people make the kind of meaning they want to make with the mechanism they want to use to make it. And sometimes it's religion, and sometimes it's Christianity. And sometimes it's just figuring out what it means to be human. And I think there are a lot of people, like you said, there would maybe be some people that were infuriated by your answer. There are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with that. And I've sat in enough of these conversations, to know that it's like in this conversation, we're all very comfortable with what we mean using certain vernacular, and we understand boundaries, and we understand, well, if we're in a conversation and we say, well, we don't want to answer that, or we're not going to check that box, we're not going to do it. But I've been in so many conversations where there has just been such a hard push.
Yes.
And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to say this. I'm not going to, like, this is what I'm saying about myself and my journey and my story. This is how I'm identifying, and that's it. And then you kind of get pushed. And again, it's been a while since I've been in these conversations, even though I've been in many of them, because I've learned my lesson. It took a very long time for me to learn boundaries and learn my lesson. But it's like, well, okay, you don't have to say you're this, and that, but just tell us, do you believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus Christ? Like, as if that's such an easy thing to answer, or even an important thing to answer. And so I think it's just going to be interesting to see how this conversation continues, to see how deep the divide might go. And what practitioners like you are going to be offering the religious trauma conversation. So is there anything you want to say in close? We always kind of invite our listeners, where can they find you and the work you're doing, what you have set up, and just kind of an encouraging word, or really anything you'd like to end on. We'll just leave it totally in your court, totally open.
Well, for an encouraging word, I think I would say, just as there are lots of folks that want to push for an answer and want to define, might be frustrated by an ambiguous gray space. I think there are a lot of folks that also feel encouraged by those of us who are identifying, religiously ambiguously. There we go. Yep. That's a mouthful. And so I think there's that too, and there's a space for those people. So I'm a big believer in, every space doesn't have to be for everyone, so the times that I have taken a risk and been vulnerable about my journey with others on social media, I have been surprised at who has reached out and said, me too, I feel that way too. And so I think that is even more underground than, there's a deconstruction conversation, and then more underground is the reconstruction conversation that, okay, yes, I reject all that. And I'm also still hopeful and still building something and still trying to find cards to build some kind of tower back. It might look different than the one I'm supposed to have, quote unquote, but there's the hope of reconstruction. And so I think that's the encouraging word for folks, that deconstruction shouldn't be the end. I don't think that is what any of us is trying to say here. But that reconstruction is a really hopeful thing too. And it does not have to end in a binary thing, a journey back to where we came from, or a journey to something that's also defined, but that it can just be something of our own creation as humans.
Reconstruction of our humanity after it.
Yes, so the reconstruction of humanity. I mean, that is my, hopefully my life's work, the reconstruction of humanity, and knowing that gets to be a very individualized experience. And that's what I seek to do in the work that I do. In terms of where I can be found for practice right now, I'm still in a training experience where it's an internal referral system. So I'm not currently taking new clients, but in the near future, I hope to have a practice where I'm doing that. Something that I am doing on my own is I do have a consulting business where I do workshops, and it's kind of open. I will work with churches, I will work with HR departments, I will work with teams, really just having challenging conversations. And so it's something I'm really passionate about too. I'm really proud of my education journey and the expertise that I've developed to be able to hold conversations around issues of humanity, issues of relational challenges, issues of systemic issues. And so I do some of that work on the side too. I do a little bit of everything. And so I will forward on a link to my website. So I do a bit of everything. Like I said, some workshops and trainings. I also do data analysis for community organizations, doing surveys on, most recently, I worked with Minneapolis, a community survey in Minneapolis, looking at communities of color and their attitudes on policing. So with what's happening with George Floyd in our city right now, that's been very timely and very important work for me as well. So I'm kind of in that cool part of my career where I also get to be a jack of all trades if I want to be, and I have some unique things that I'm passionate about, but love to keep my hands in a lot of different pots. So I will connect you with where I can be found. And also just for personal conversations as well. I love connecting with others who want to think openly and dialogue about a whole range of issues and fun topics.
Yes, absolutely. I'll put all of that in the show notes, so you can find Kim and her work. And you're so busy. You're doing such amazing work. You're doing so many things all the time. I know when we kind of have our talks and we schedule them, because you are someone who needs to be scheduled, because you're just doing so much good work and so many important things. So thanks for all the work that you're doing, and thanks for coming on here and talking with us a little bit about it. And we hope to have you back soon and get an update on how the field of religious trauma has opened up and kind of what you're doing in it. So thank you so much. And thank you to all our listeners. Keep hanging with us each week, especially in these deconstruction talks. They're important. And we're glad you're with us for them. So until next week, thank you. And we will see you then. Bye.
Bye, Kim. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you.